Humans, without a doubt the smartest animal on Earth. Yet we're unmistakably tied to our ape origins. Millions of years ago, we were apes living ape lives in Africa. So how did we get from that to this? The questions are huge, but at last, there are answers. More than 6 million years ago, we took that first step to separate from the apes.
We see the launching of the career that ultimately led to Homo sapiens.
And 3 million years ago, we see the roots of our big brain begin to take hold in a tiny creature, more like a chimp than a human.
The frontier of human evolution is really being brought to this razor-sharp edge.
And we now know that for millions of years, many different human-like species lived together on the planet, until one day, there was only us. Homo sapiens, the most complex, adaptable animal on Earth. So how did we get this way, and why? A radical new theory reveals how episodes of cataclysmic change forced our ancestors to adapt or die. Eventually, this change in posture would be followed by a change in their brains. Somehow, over time, they would become us. In the Sahara Desert, a 6 million-year-old fossil called Tumai may hold the secret of how we first walked upright.
On est en train d'écrire peut-être le
We are writing the first chapter of human evolution.
tout près du
We are very close to the beginning.
tout près.
Very close.
And the fossilized bones of a child from 3.5 million years ago hint to us about the beginnings of human thought. We're discovering how many different human species lived on Earth at the same time, and why all but one died out. We, Homo sapiens, are the first ever to be alone. Her journey began a very, very long time ago. Imagine the entire span of recorded human history, taking us back to the Egyptian pyramids, about 5,000 years. Double it, 10,000 years ago, when plants were domesticated and agriculture begins. Double it again, to the time when Ice Age hunters paint stunning images on cave walls. And keep doubling, 6 more times, taking us back 1.3 million years, when the first creature who really looked like us hunted on the plains of Africa. And then keep traveling back another 2 million years, and only then do we arrive in the time when Salam lived in Ethiopia, nearly 3.5 million years ago. He quickly identifies her. She's from a species considered by most scientists to be an ancient ancestor. Australopithecus afarensis, a small chimp-like creature who walked on 2 legs. This is the same species as the famous Lucy, discovered in the 1970s by Don Johanson.
Lucy was terribly important because she was really an amalgam and of different characteristics of ape and human.
I think specimens like Salam and Lucy are extraordinary simply because you can look at them and see evolution in the making.
Never before had a child's skeleton been found so ancient and so complete. Her bones would fit in a shoebox, but they speak volumes about her life. For example, to find out how old she was when she died, Zerai looked at her teeth, but not the baby teeth visible in her jaw. The adult teeth growing inside the bone, as seen in a CT scan. From that, we know Salam died at age 3. Like Lucy, she testifies to a crucial step in our evolution. Unlike apes, these creatures walked upright, as the first fossil Don Johansen found clearly revealed. From the waist down, Lucy was like us. From the waist up, she and her kind were all ape. Salam's skeleton is the same, with chimp-like shoulder blades giving her the range of motion needed for climbing and swinging. These ancient creatures must have spent time in the trees, possibly sleeping there at night to keep away from predators, but walking upright on the ground during the day. This is where the ancestors of Salam and Lucy lived. They probably looked a lot like chimps. But then Africa started to gradually dry out. The rainforest began to shrink. They had been creatures who spent most of their time in trees, like chimps and orangutans today. But as their forests shrank, some of them developed the trait that we take for granted: bipedalism, walking on two legs.
Bipedalism is such an unusual trait. There's no other mammal that habitually walks on two legs like we do.
Because it's unique, it's hard to figure out why it happened. There are a lot of theories.
One of them is that they stood up to be able to see over tall grass. Another theory, they stood up to be able to pick fruits off of the low branches of trees, the way chimpanzees do today. Another theory states that they stood up to cool more efficiently so that we don't have as much sun beating on so much of our body.
And I think the most compelling idea, the most compelling hypothesis is that it saved us energy.
Walking was tiring, but they didn't have to walk far.
But if you're a chimp and you only walk 2 to 3 kilometers a day, it doesn't really mean much, right? It's not going to have that much of an effect on your energy budget.
But energy demands would change as the forest started to disappear. Our ape ancestors had to walk more.
They have to go farther to get from one fruit patch to another fruit patch, for example.
A chimp is an energy glutton.
It spends an enormous amount of energy, about 4 times as much energy as a human walking.
Whether it walks on 4 legs or 2, a chimp can't compete with the human gait.
It's poorly designed to withstand the forces of gravity. It has to spend a lot of muscular effort to keep itself from collapsing into a little pile of chimpness or whatever with each step.
When Lucy's kind were first discovered, many people thought they were the so-called missing link between apes and humans. But the science of genetics has transformed our understanding with a technique called the molecular clock. Today, scientists can compare DNA from closely related species to find out how long ago they split from a common ancestor. Living forms evolve because DNA sometimes spontaneously changes as it copies itself. These changes happen at a surprisingly regular rate. By counting the differences between the genetic code of chimps and humans, we can calculate how long they've been evolving away from each other.
The dates that one almost always gets are around 5 to 7 million years ago for when humans and chimpanzees last shared a common ancestor.
Here was proof that humans diverged from the apes much earlier than we thought, about 6 million years ago. It shows Lucy and Salam weren't one step removed from chimps, but many. They may even be closer to us than to the first human ancestor. So what came before Lucy and Salam? Who was our earliest ancestor?
Nous avons décidé
We decided to go to Africa,
En Afrique,
but to the west,
mais à l'ouest. À l'ouest.
to the west of the Great Rift.
1,600 miles to the west, at the edge of the Sahara Desert in northern Chad. Then, on their 26th expedition in 2001, they found a smashed, misshapen skull around 6 million years old. They called it Sahelanthropus chidensis. There were no bones apart from the skull. The cast allows Michelle to answer an important question. Did this ancient creature walk on two legs millions of years before Lucy or Salam? It's how the skull connects to the spine that provides the vital clue. And Michelle could infer that from the shape of Toumai's skull. If Toumai's skull is set on the neck of an ape that walks on all fours, his eyes point downward. That can't be right. Set on the upright spine of a biped, his eyes point straight ahead. For Michelle, this proved Toumai walked upright. If Michelle is right, his 6 million year old fossil is a good candidate for the first human ancestor. Discoveries like this are changing the way we see human evolution.
Everyone thought that we left the trees, walked on the ground upright, freed our hands, made tools, got big brains, reduced our canines, and so on, all at the same time.
But walking upright may not have automatically led to big brains at all. From Toumai to Salam, both bipeds, brains stayed small. And they weren't the only ones. Over millions of years, there was a profusion of upright walkers with complicated names and chimp-sized brains. Like Auroran tuganensis.
What we're seeing is a fluorescence of species, multiple species. They're probably subtly different from each other.
Ardipithecus ramidus.
But it's important to recognize that there are not major differences among these species.
Australopithecus africanus.
They were all bipeds, big snouts, more or less chimp-sized brains.
Kenyanthropus platyops.
This way of life, this suite of adaptations, lasted for millions of years.
But as a group, they flourished for about 25 times longer than we've been around. They survived and thrived as brain size flatlined for almost 4 million years.
By age 3, a chimpanzee would have over 90% of the brain formed.
But Salam's brain was only around 75% of its adult size, suggesting it was growing up slower. But is there any other evidence Salam's brain was becoming more human and less ape? To find out, compare a human brain to a chimp's. So did Salam have the deep furrow and small neocortex of a chimp? Or had something changed? Still the size of a chimp's, Salam's brain had been rewired. But there was a long way to go. Almost 500,000 years, the fossil record is virtually silent. But in this blank period, something is happening. In 2.5 million year old layers, scientists begin to find something new. We might be tempted to call them rocks, but someone was shaping them. They are the first stone tools. It's considered unlikely they were made by Australopithecus, Lucy's kind.
Australopithecus was around for a couple of million years and did not make stone tools.
But if not Lucy's kind, then who? Finally, the skulls of a new creature begin to turn up. Is this the toolmaker? The skulls are different from what came before. They represent the dawn of a new era, beginning around 2 million years ago. This is our era, the era of the genus Homo, humans. The mysterious toolmaker, Homo habilis, is the first of these new creatures.
But we definitely have evidence that the stone tools were being used to break the long bones in order to get to the marrow inside the long bones. There were clear cut marks on the bones of turtles, crocodiles, big antelopes, little antelopes, even hippos, really big animals like hippos. So we know that meat had become a new important part of the diet of Homo habilis. In Homo habilis, we see an expansion of that area behind the orbits that points to an expansion in the cognitive capabilities of higher functions, of higher reasoning functions of the brain.
It was an expansion equivalent to a doubling of brain volume.
Once you go from something like 400 cc's in Australopithecines to, say, 700, 800 cc's in Homo habilis, yes, you're getting a big increase in cognitive capacity.
2 million years ago, what jump-started human evolution? These periods of climate instability be the key to understanding the evolutionary leap from small bipedal apes to the larger-brained toolmaker, Homo habilis. For the 3 million years between Toumai and Salam, when brain size was flatlining, African climate was stable, dry, getting a little drier. Then came 200,000 years of wildly varying climate, careening unpredictably between wet and dry. During that time, stone tools appeared, along with the larger-brained creatures that made them. Africa was also home to many other human-like species. Climate instability put pressure on all of them. Those that couldn't adapt died out, like Salam and Lucy's kind. Better problem solvers, like Homo habilis, survived. The new discoveries about ancient climate upheavals in Africa have led Rick Potts to formulate a bold theory of human evolution.
The traditional idea we have had about human evolution is that it was the savanna, the grassy plain with some trees on it, that was the driving force. But instead, what we've discovered is that climate changed all the time. And so the idea that we've come up with is that variability itself was the driving force of human evolution, and that our ancestors were adapted to change itself.
It's a simple but revolutionary idea. Human evolution is nature's experiment with versatility. We're not adapted to any one environment or climate, but to many. We are creatures of climate change. Today, climate change seems to threaten our survival. But it may have held the keys to the astonishing story of how we became who we are. Because it didn't stop 2 million years ago. These dramatic upheavals would continue for another 1.5 million years, propelling our ancestors down a road leading ultimately to the smartest creature the world has ever known. New discoveries are shining light on the final stages of our evolution. We're finding out where our species, Homo sapiens, came from.
The genetic record shows us that all modern humans are descended from a small population of approximately 600 breeding individuals.
And we are discovering how they spread through the world, pushing out other ancient humans like the Neanderthal.
Neanderthals were very successful humans. They have lived in Europe for maybe 300, 400,000 years, but eventually they were replaced by modern humans.
But why were they replaced by modern humans? The mystery of the Neanderthal disappearance is finally being solved as the secrets of their genetic code are unlocked. We're discovering exactly What made them different from us?
The Neanderthals go extinct.
For almost 400,000 years, the Neanderthals lived in Ice Age Europe. Superb hunters, they had brains bigger than ours and a record of survival twice as long. They were the most advanced humans on Earth. Disappeared on the African plains almost 2 million years ago. They were the first ancestors who had bodies like ours. They were hunter-gatherers and tool makers, beings who lived in social groups and cared for each other. It was probably Homo erectus, almost 2 million years ago, who first started to leave Africa. Ever since, Africa has been the engine of our evolution, pumping out wave after wave ancient humans who populated Europe and Asia. Settling in far-off places, they developed in their own special ways. An early wave gave rise in Indonesia to the extraordinary hobbit, perhaps a type of dwarf Homo erectus. Another wave took Homo erectus all the way to China, where fossil remains have been dated to over 700,000 years ago. Soon after, another wave left Africa, this time heading for Europe. This was the species that would one day give rise to the Neanderthals. Ever since the first skull was discovered in Heidelberg, Germany, they have been called Homo heidelbergensis. But almost nothing was known about it until one extraordinary find was made. To evolve, eventually becoming the species who would populate Europe, the Neanderthals. Of all ancient humans, the Neanderthals were the closest to us. Their brains were slightly larger than ours. Their short, heavy-set bodies helped them survive repeated ice ages. They were hunters, living off the big game that roamed the edges of the great ice sheets covering Europe and Central Asia. When Neanderthal fossils were first discovered, Darwin had yet to publish his theory of evolution. The idea that modern humans had descended from more primitive forms would generate furious controversy.
Il s'agit du crâne d'Angie II.
This is the skull of Angus II. It is the first Neanderthal fossil ever found on Earth. It was discovered at the end of 1829. But back then, people were not happy with the idea that this could be a human being like us.
We've known for a long time that Neanderthals look different from modern humans ever since they were first discovered and described. But the question then becomes, what does this difference actually mean?
This is a digitized 3D image of our own skull, with its characteristic high dome. By contrast, the Neanderthal skull is low and elongated, possibly indicating a different brain shape. The parts of the Neanderthal brain, called the parietal and temporal lobes, may have been slightly smaller. That small difference could have had a large impact on their mental ability.
There are regions of the parietal lobes and the temporal lobes that are very important in cognition, particularly in terms of language, in memory, in remembering spatial locations.
The reduced size of those regions of Neanderthal brains might be a sign of limited thinking powers. Their skeletons tell us that very few lived beyond the age of 30. But as a species, the Neanderthals were long-lived. They lasted for almost 400,000 years.
It looks like 4 to 6 potential locations in Africa that would still be supportive of hunter-gatherer populations.
Despite the refuges, there is evidence our ancestors were pushed to the brink of extinction.
The genetic record shows us that all modern humans are descended from a small population of of approximately 600 breeding individuals.
There's disagreement about the numbers and timing, but it does seem that all people on Earth are descended from a very small original population in Africa. As they moved into Asia, they might have come across Homo erectus, or the tiny hobbit. There's no evidence for such a meeting, but there is one encounter we can be more certain about. As a separate wave slowly moved through the Middle East into Europe, they must have met the Neanderthals. What were those meetings like? For many years, scientists speculated that early Homo sapiens populations absorbed the Neanderthals through interbreeding. If they did, there would be traces of Neanderthal DNA in our genes today. But there was no way to detect Neanderthal DNA until researchers at the Max Planck Institute set out on a daring scientific odyssey: the quest to sequence the Neanderthal genome. The human genome contains approximately 3 billion chemical bases, the A's, T's, C's, and G's that make up our genes. Mapping that was hard enough. The idea of mapping the genome of a long extinct species seemed pure fantasy. But that didn't stop Svante Pääbo from dreaming about it. The first problem was to get DNA from Neanderthal bones over 30,000 years old. Finally, taking great care not to contaminate it with their own, they isolated the first piece of Neanderthal DNA. And one such comparison is already giving us deeper insight into the Neanderthal brain. The gene called FOXP2.
It's the only gene we know of today that's involved in speech and language development in humans. We know that because if one copy is lost in a human due to a mutation, we have a severe speech problem.
When first discovered, FOXP2 created a lot of excitement. Although many animals have the FOXP2 gene, the human version is unique. Some thought it was the gene for language. We now know that complex traits like language are controlled by many genes. Yet researchers agree the human version of FOXP2 is closely tied to some of the basic motor skills necessary for speech.
And the big question was, of course, is that shared with Neanderthals or not? And when we now look at it in the Neanderthal, indeed it looks to be identical with us.
If we share the capacity for language with the Neanderthals, could we both have inherited it from the same source? A common ancestor who gave rise to both species. Who was it? In the genetic code of Neanderthals and ourselves, simply comparing the A's, T's, C's, and G's in our DNA, scientists can calculate how long the two species have been diverging.
We can then estimate when there was a common ancestral population, where some individuals went on to become modern humans, some went on to become Neanderthals. It's in the order of, say, 300,000, 400,000 years ago.
This is Homo heidelbergensis, who we now know is our ancestor too. In Europe, they evolved into the Neanderthal. In Africa, groups that had not yet migrated evolved into Homo sapiens. So DNA is revealing we share a common ancestor with the Neanderthals. But do we carry some vestige of Neanderthal DNA in our genes?
We don't see really traces of Neanderthal genes.
With no evidence of interbreeding, it now seems more likely that as our population grew, We simply pushed the Neanderthals out of their environments. Needs were huge.
They had this big body, this big brain, living in a rather cold environment. So we have estimates of their energy consumption every day. It's about 5,000 kilocalories. It's about what someone racing the Tour de France is spending every day.
But with slimmer, taller bodies, modern humans had lower energy demands by the extinction of large animals. In Europe and Asia, the arrival of Homo sapiens coincides with the disappearance of the hairy mammoth, the cave lion, and other large mammals. In Australia, most animals weighing over 100 pounds vanish within a few thousand years of our arrival. The Neanderthals were just one of many species that disappeared when we arrived. Gradually, they were pushed into marginal areas of Europe. Their last refuge seems to have been the Rock of Gibraltar 28,000 years ago. Then, they vanished. Nature is the storehouse of our complex ways of thinking and perceiving. And we pass it on to our children as surely as we pass on our genes. The ways in which cultural evolution and genetic evolution interact will be at the forefront of the research of tomorrow. Because one thing is for sure, evolution is not stopping.